Okay, so today being an anniversary, in fact the 52nd anniversary of the landing of Apollo 11 on the moon, I'm going to talk about exactly how that happened. I'm going to start this story as I usually do at the end of the Second World War, and then I'll sort of talk you through some things that happened along the way that ended up with Neil Armstrong stepping out onto the surface of the moon. 52 years ago today. I remember it. I was at school at the time. I was 7, and it's sort of that whole thing kicked off a lifelong experience of astronomy and space and stuff for me. So very important to me. But I'll start off just with some things that happened, and really rocketry. So World War II, they started building rockets. Adolf Hitler really was sort of desperate towards the end of World War II to sort of get some fight back and try and win the war, which he started to lose at that point. And one of the things that he built, they built two actually. They built the V1, which was the flying bomb, which was a jet aircraft, basically with explosives on board, and it just flew from Germany to London and dropped its bombs there. And then they wanted a faster, more powerful way of delivering explosives to London. They built the V2 rocket. There is a V2. Now the man in charge of that was a guy called Wernher von Braun, who was an engineer, and he had dreams of sending rockets to planets and stuff. And the way World War II sort of ended, this went two ways. That the actual engineers involved, Wernher von Braun and his team, had sort of caught wind of the fact that the war was coming to an end, and that really for their own sort of personal safety, it might be better if they surrendered to the Americans rather than the Russians. And so they made their way west, and they actually surrendered to the Allied forces in what became West Germany. Whereas the actual building plant, the manufacturing plants that were making the rockets, they ended up in the hands of the Russians. So this went two ways. The Russians got the manufacturing plants, the factories, and America got the engineers. And so Wernher von Braun was taken into custody, and they sort of came to an arrangement where if he worked for the Americans, they'd overlook the fact that he'd been firing these rockets towards London. Now, actually, just as a little aside, I will tell you, my father, who grew up in World War II in London, he's probably one of the few surviving people who actually saw a V2 rocket explode over London in 1944. And such is the wonder of the internet that he's actually traced back from his memories. You can actually find on the internet all the records of which rocket was fired and by whom. And he's actually found that it was November 1944 and the rocket was actually landed over Ilford, which is East London. He was West London. And he even got the name of the Obergruppenführer who ordered the launch of the rocket. So the Russians started building their own V2s, a thing called the R1, after the war, but straightforward copy of the V2. And the Americans did likewise. They modified it. They built a sort of a second stage on it and called it Bumper. And Bumper was actually capable of going to the edge of space with the second stage on it. Things evolved even more so, and this is the Russians evolved their V2 up to this huge thing here called the R7. And this has got 5 engines on the back, each of which has 4 chambers on it, a very powerful rocket. And that was not designed to go into space. That was wholly designed to drop bombs on America, atomic ones as well. And that was built in 1954, but they started to look at other ways of using this, and on the 4th of October 1957 they put a satellite on it, and this happened.
On October the 4th, 1957, while the Americans were still finalizing their plans, Sputnik was launched.
Then its casing opened. The springs snapped, and the nose cone was pushed out of the way. a ball with 4 antennae emerged to go it alone in the darkness of space. And a radio began to send a signal back to Earth. Humanity had entered the space age.
So, as you can imagine, the Americans, whose development of rockets was still fairly primitive at this time, they had rockets, but they'd never had any focus to what they were doing, and they had several rockets, all military, but nothing like that. And when they saw this satellite above them, they sort of started to think, well, that could carry bombs or cameras or all sorts of things. So they realized they had to get their act together. So what they did, they responded, and in 1958 they pulled together all the strands of space exploration and put them under one body. NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, formed July 1958, and the first thing they did was they went about finding some astronauts, and they sort of actually got them from test pilots of aircraft and stuff from the military. And they had this mission to place a human-rated spacecraft in Earth orbit, observe the astronaut's performance in such conditions, and return him safely to the Earth. And that's what they did with Project Mercury. But in the meantime, to get one further step ahead, the Russians had actually put a man on top of Vostok 1. Was again a Soyuz, like the R7 you saw earlier. And in fact, all the Soyuz spacecraft to this stage are like that. They did one design, they got it pretty right the first time, they've modified it loads of times ever since. And when you see a Soyuz go up from Baikonur Stardome now, it's one of those pretty much. Better, but that's it. There's a lot of rumour about this when we're talking about the Soviet Union in 1961 here. And it was rumoured at one point that Yuri Gagarin was not the first man launched into space. He was merely actually the first one they got back, which is a bit scary. And I sort of delved into this and found that one of the stories that's come out is that there was a previous astronaut called Igor Ivanovich. And pictures existed, covertly taken by spies, of an astronaut, dead astronaut, being pulled out of a Soyuz capsule on the ground. And this was Igor Ivanovich. And it actually turns out that that's not really true. Igor Ivanovich was a crash test dummy who had been launched into space on a Soyuz capsule and got back, and they took readings of the stresses and strains he'd been under to see if it was actually possible to launch a man into space. So they got Gagarin up. And again, America had to respond to this, and this is America's response.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
So there you go. That's a fairly clear mission statement. He's got a time limit of the end of 1969, the end of the decade, and a clear objective to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. So that's what we're up against here. So the first thing they went about was Project Mercury. Project Mercury was 6 rocket launches. The first 2 were the Mercury capsule, the single astronaut Mercury capsule on top of a Mercury Redstone rocket. We'll see one of those in a minute. The Redstone was quite a small rocket. It's military, designed to have a missile on it, but they put a manned capsule on it instead. And the first one was Alan B. Shepard, 5th of May 1961. He did a 15-minute suborbital flight on Freedom 7. And just to compare with today, we saw the so-called New Shepard launched today by Jeff Bezos and his crew, and that did a 10-minute suborbital flight. Alan B. Shepard, he went to 116 miles, Jeff Bezos went to 65, so we haven't necessarily progressed a fantastic amount in 60 years. But that's that. Gus Grissom likewise was on a Redstone, and so that was a 15-minute suborbital flight as well. Then the big one, and Jeff Bezos is going to replicate this as well with what he's calling New Glenn, his next flight. And that was on a more powerful rocket, a Mercury Atlas, which is a much bigger military rocket, and that was powerful enough to get that capsule right into orbit, 4 hours and 55 minutes flight, just over 2 orbits, before it came down safe with John Glenn on board. And then there were 3 more Mercuries, and really the biggest and longest was Gordo Cooper's in 1963, and they reckon they'd really cracked that. The business of going up, coming down, that's simple. So that was Project Mercury. This is the Mercury capsule here, and this is a Redstone rocket. So that was the first 2 Mercuries were like that. That was the escape tower on top. They all had this, but it's a bit of a misnomer, really. The idea was that if this all exploded down here, and that is just, purely fuel, then this rocket would fire and pull the capsule clear. And you'd think that's great, except that this can all explode in half a second, and that takes 2 seconds to fire. So not really. Fortunately, never had to be used in anger, because it's just as well, because it might not have been much use. This is the Mercury Atlas that took John Glenn and the other 3 Mercury astronauts up, and that, incidentally, you can see just behind there. So I haven't got a full picture of it. This is a Gemini. We'll come to a Gemini in a minute, and that's a Titan II missile that it's on. Again, a military missile. So the next step, having perfected going up and going down, they needed to perfect some more skills in space, and Project Gemini, and I did say Gemini, but they did put out a press release in 1966 saying, guys, it's Gemini, not Gemini. They had some more astronauts by this point, the Mercury 7, the New 9, and the class of 1963, they were termed. And Gemini here was a 2-man capsule lifted up by that Titan II ICBM military booster, whose usual job was to carry atomic bombs to Moscow. And I've stood next to one that was geared up to do exactly that, actually in a nuclear silo in Arizona that I went 2 years ago. The objectives, what they wanted to do, they needed to learn much more about skills in space. So they did manoeuvring, rendezvous, docking, all that stuff, endurance. They did a 14-day Gemini mission just to, although it only went to low Earth orbit, that was the sort of duration you needed to do a full trip to the moon and back, including going down landing. 12 missions, of which 10 were manned, and it did the first extravehicular activity as well. Ed White, he became the first American to actually get outside the capsule and walk in space. Unfortunately, he wasn't the first person to do that, because that was Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov, who did it a couple of months before. Now then, Project Apollo. They started to think about how they were going to actually get to the moon, and they considered 3 ways of doing it. And way number 1, direct ascent. That is, sending a single rocket to the moon. So you launch from the Earth, take off, go to the moon, land on the moon, launch off the moon again, and come straight back to Earth. Ever so simple, except that to do it you need a fantastically large rocket, much bigger than the Saturn V they eventually built. In fact, they designed but never built what was called Nova, or the Saturn C8, and that was a Saturn V. Instead of having 5 gigantic engines on the back, it had the same engines, only 8 of them. And that was sort of ruled out on the grounds of being far too big and heavy to actually make a workable spacecraft out of. So idea number 2 was Earth Orbit Rendezvous. And that's, instead of launching a giant rocket from the Earth, you actually send it up in pieces and put it together in low Earth orbit, and then send it to the moon from there. And that way you don't need to have one gigantic rocket. You can have several small ones take all the bits up, and it's not such a big rocket that you need to launch from low Earth orbit, because you've done most of the work of getting out of gravity by getting the stuff up there. And they thought that wouldn't work terribly well either, so they went for Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, which is what they did. And that's the one where you launch from the Earth, but you also bring a smaller spacecraft with you. And it's the smaller spacecraft that goes down to the moon and then comes back. And then the guys, they dock up again and come back in the bigger spacecraft. And that's what they did. That's how Apollo worked. Now then, while they were getting all that together, they had a major setback. They built the first Apollo capsule, Apollo 1, and put it on top of a smaller rocket, a Saturn V, and they tested it all out. They'd tested all the parts, and so they tested it all out on the launch pad on the 27th of January 1967. And the problem was that it caught fire. It caught fire because, well, a number of things came together really, that there was poor quality wiring in it, and so they got sparks, and they had been using a 100% oxygen atmosphere, because that makes certain things easier. Comes with problems too, because anything that burns in air burns 5 times better in oxygen, and this happened here. Then they found, once the fire had started, they found that they built the capsule with a door that opened inwards, and so the pressure of the fire just sealed the door shut, so they couldn't get out. And 30 seconds later, all 3 astronauts in there were killed. Total tragedy. They didn't die in vain, because they learned everything they could from that fire. Things like, don't use 100% oxygen. That's not a good idea. Not at full pressure. They did find that they could use it at like sort of 5 psi, which is about what it is in normal air. Don't make the door open outwards. Sorry, don't make the door open inwards, make the door open outwards, so that if there is pressure in there, it will blow open rather than seal itself shut. Lots of things like that. They completely rebuilt the capsule, and they called it Block 2. So they then went about building the Saturn V rocket, and this was the thing that would get it all aloft. And they'd started this in 1961. The first flight, we'll see that in a minute, it's quite dramatic, 9th of November 1967. They built altogether 15 Saturn Vs, flew 13 of them. They're all successful. The remaining 2 are still on the ground, one at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida and one at the Johnson Space Center in Texas. It is 363 feet or 110.7 meters high. The weight was 6.5 million pounds. This is interesting actually, then the thrust was 7.5 million pounds, and so it only moved quite slowly off the launch pad. You've got to bear in mind though that the 4.5 million pounds was just the first stage fuel, and of course as it starts to launch, that fuel burns and it gets lighter and lighter and lighter, so it goes faster and faster and faster. And that first stage lasts 168 seconds. It burns RP1 and liquid oxygen. RP1 is a refined version of aviation fuel, which is liquid at normal temperature. And liquid oxygen is liquid oxygen. The other engines all burnt liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The reason they used kerosene for the first stage was actually to keep the balance right. To keep the rocket upright. They found that it was easier if it had a heavier fuel in the first stage. And that's all it is really. That burnt for 168 seconds, 2 minutes, just under 3 minutes, just short of 3 minutes. And by which time the spacecraft was doing 6,000 miles per hour. So it's fairly good acceleration. Then the second stage kicked in. And unlike a lot of later spacecraft, the Saturn V worked. In the first stage fired first, and then the second stage took over. And I'm told that the G-force from being accelerating at full power when the first stage burns out and then nothing, and then suddenly the second stage kicks in again, the G-force involved in that is roughly like driving a car into a wall at 40 miles per hour. and that's why those guys had to be heavily padded, heavily strapped in, and indeed extremely well trained to cope with G-forces. That went for another 3 minutes, so another 6 minutes, and then the third stage took it right up into orbit. That was it, and that's 3,000 gallons every second were burnt in the first stage. Now, I'm going to show you the first Saturn V launch, which is Apollo 4. Very crazy numbering got them to Apollo 4, but that's what it was. Unmanned launch of Saturn V, and what they did was what they called all-up testing, where they built the whole thing and just let it go. And they built a mission that tested every aspect of it. So it launched, first, second, third stages all tested, then they fired it up and fired it back towards the Earth as if it was coming back from the moon, and landed the capsule in the ocean. So complete unmanned mission. But they forgot about a few things. And the thing to do, watch the pictures by all means, the pictures are great, but listen to the commentary on this, because the commentary is fantastic. This is a whole bunch of reporters who'd never seen anything like this, trying to describe what they saw. And what NASA had forgotten to do, which they did with every subsequent big rocket launch ever, was they didn't dump loads of gallons of water on the launch pad to mostly suppress vibration. I mean, heat is also a problem, but the amount of vibration was horrific, and these guys 3 miles away were nearly shaken to bits by this. And listen to the commentary.
Good morning. Behind me is the largest single object man has ever attempted to lift off the face of the Earth. Its official designation is Saturn V. It stands as tall as a 36-story building, and though it is unmanned for this flight, this is the monster rocket with which America ultimately will place men on the moon.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 5, 4, we have ignition.
All engines are running. We have liftoff. We have liftoff at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The tower has...
My God, our building's shaking here. Our building's shaking. Oh, it's terrific. The building's shaking. This big glass window is shaking. We're holding it with our hands. Look at that rocket go into the clouds at 3,000 feet. The roar is terrific. Look at it going. You can see it. You can see it. Part of our roof has come in here.
We don't know if you can hear, ladies and gentlemen, but all the flight is moving along as it should be. But our observation booth here, the NBC observation booth, is literally being shaken apart. Our tape recorders are being thrown to the floor by the roar of this mighty rocket as it continues to climb into the sky on its 7.5 billion pounds of thrust. It is a beautiful sight, an unbelievable sight.
Frank, there's just never been anything like it. The Titan II that powered Gemini, the Mercury Atlas that powered John Glenn on our early orbital flights, they looked impressive at the time. But not until you felt your flesh vibrate and your desk lift and your body thunder with the vibration from that rocket going could you sense the excitement. It's just bigger, and it worked better the first time than anything we've ever used. The spacecraft is now well into its first revolution around the Earth, and a historic flight well underway. Frank?
Thank you very much, Jules. I know you've had a very pleasant morning. Well, Apollo 4 is on the way, and the mission apparently seems to be going well. I think for NASA and for America's space program, you can say, oh, what a beautiful morning this has been. This is Frank Reynolds in New York.
I have to say that's probably one of my favourite pieces of news coverage of any event ever. It's terrific. Slight error. when they show you the Saturn rocket in the hangar there, that's actually a Saturn 1B, not a Saturn V, but you have to look closely to tell the difference. So, Apollo 8, they moved on from the great success of Apollo 4. There were a couple of other test flights. Apollo 5 was a small rocket that just tested the lunar module for the first time. Apollo 6 was an interesting one in that it was the second Saturn V launch, and it was actually less successful than Apollo 4, but this was the health and safety. It nearly shook itself to bits, in fact, and if they put astronauts on Apollo 6, they probably wouldn't have come back alive. But this is 1960s health and safety. And what they said was, oh, we know what the vibration problem is and we can solve that. So they did. And now you probably have a few more test launches, flights to make sure that it worked. And but this was the 1960s, and they just said, okay, that's fine, we'll do Apollo 8 with men on it. So that's what they did. They were going to just launch Apollo 8 as a low Earth orbit test of the Saturn V rocket with men on it. But they decided that as it was rumoured the Russians were sort of getting somewhere with their own lunar mission, they thought, well, they'd better get a bit of a move on. So what they did, they said, well, we haven't got a lunar module yet, so we can't go to the moon and land. What we could do is we could go to the moon and go round it 10 times and come back. And so that's what they did over Christmas, 1968, which was, this is where I took my first interest in the thing myself, Apollo 8. Terrific mission. Here was the configuration of the 3 astronauts in the Apollo spacecraft. And you see they've got their 3 seats where they spend most of the time here with all the controls laid out in front of them. They have got some additional space to use behind the seats here, where they can go and get out of their suits and stuff like that. But so it wasn't. It was a fairly cramped existence. But for 10 days, 6 days in the case of Apollo 8, it worked. So there was the crew, Frank Borman, commander, Jim Lovell, command module pilot, Bill Anders, lunar module pilot. He didn't really have his work cut out, Bill Anders, because there was no lunar module for him to pilot, but he did plenty of other good things, as we'll see later. Launched on 21st of December 1968, Eastern Standard, in the morning, that's Eastern Standard Time. Reached orbit on Christmas Eve, went round 10 times. Returned to Earth on the 27th, splashed down actually in darkness in the Pacific. So that was the Apollo 8. And I'm going to talk just a little bit, as a complete aside, before we come back to Apollo 8, about the computers used in Apollo, because it's a very relevant thing to modern technology. This is Mission Control, Houston. That's my photograph of it. It's not really bent. It's all in a straight line, but this is a sort of a panoramic photograph that kind of gets bent a bit in the sticking together of frames. This was the emergency red telephone. If they were going to explode a spacecraft or whatever, they had to tell the President and Department of Defense on this red telephone. Mission director sits here. He's the man in charge. Flight director, he's actually running the flight here. And there's a guy just here called the capsule communicator, or Capcom. We'll see more about the Capcom in a minute. And he is the only person in this room who talks to the astronauts, and he is an astronaut himself, so he's their eyes and ears in mission control, the Capcom, and we'll see more what he does in a minute. All of these screens, they just really carried text and primitive graphics, and they all ran off one mainframe computer, an IBM 360. It had 1 megabyte of RAM, which was absolutely huge by 1969 standards, 68, 69. A 4 megabyte hard drive, which was actually delivered by a forklift truck in those days because it was gigantic, and then lots of tape storage here. And this is like the mainframe room. It's huge, but considering my smallest computer is bigger and more powerful than Mission Control Houston 1969. In fact, my phone is thousands of times, anyone's phone, even a simple one that's not a smartphone, is still more powerful than all this. And that wasn't it. There was a computer also on the spacecraft. Here we are, the Apollo guidance computer. This actually worked out, you know, the trajectories and all that sort of stuff, and rocket burns. And it was this lump of metal and this thing called the D-Sky, display and keyboard. There's one there, and that was actually fairly powerful for its time. It ran at a clock speed of 2 megahertz. It had mechanical memory in it. I mean, that's rope core memory, where a program is actually burnt into that by aligning magnets electrically. So that's how that works. But it's all quite primitive technology by these days, and yet it worked. It got people to the moon and back. I would actually say this little computer in thing, actually even my car keys are more powerful than that, and, you know, because all they need to do is squirt out a string of encrypted digits and open my car, but it needs more power than this had. Quite extraordinary. A lot of this was done, you know, programming by hand, and you've probably recently heard of Katherine Johnson. If you've seen the film Hidden Figures, that's her in there. And she had to work out all the trajectories and stuff by hand, because the calculator, the calculator didn't exist, but computers at the time weren't really up to it. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama in 2015, because it is true, and I'm sorry to say, that that the women involved in Project Apollo didn't get the same credit as the men. It's sad but true, and she only really died last year. At the age of 101. They did actually name eventually a building after her, not the Johnson Space Center, I hasten to add, but there is a building, and I think it's called the Katherine Johnson School of Computing or something or other. It's one of the NASA buildings, is now named after Katherine Johnson. The other prominent woman involved there, Margaret Hamilton, was the head of software development, and she wrote all these computer programs, and they printed out like this, and that was really the software that you saw for the computer that was on the previous page. So that's a bit of an aside. Now that's a Saturn V rocket. I took that picture in 1995 at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. And what they've done now, that's just how it was. It was that they left it outside. They had this spare Saturn V, thought might as well leave it outside for people to see, and they realised that eventually, of course, it was going to rot away and would be lost. So what they've done since is they then move it, so it's still exactly in that place, but they've built a hangar around it to protect it now. So you'll see it inside a hangar now, same place. The one in the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, they moved. It used to be outside the Vehicle Assembly Building, and that's now got its own hangar, the Saturn V Experience at the Kennedy Space Center. All these places, if you ever get the chance, are really well worth visiting. There's so much history involved in all this that it's fabulous. So that's Saturn V. Now then, mission control. This is an actual photo of a real live mission control on Apollo 8. And what happens? Now I explained a bit that that we have the flight director, and the Capcom sits down here. And the Capcom is the guy who talks to the astronauts, because he is an astronaut. And none of these people here, none of them talk to the astronauts. The flight director is effectively the chairman, and that all remarks are addressed through the chairman. He then tells the Capcom to speak to the astronauts, and it works that way. What they do is, when there's a decision to be taken, they do a sort of a round robin, and they sort of say, I'm looking for go, no go on landing on the moon, for example. And they'll go around there, and every one of these guys is in charge of some aspect, whether it be the astronaut's health, or the guidance, or the network, or the rockets, or whatever. They've all got some speciality, and they're watching information on these screens, and they make these decisions when the flight director asks for them. And we'll see one being made in a minute. And what I think, this is one of the most important instructions ever issued by a Capcom. And the Capcom involved, that I'm going to show you here, was actually Michael Collins. He was Capcom on Apollo 8, but he was also command module pilot on Apollo 11. So he was the guy who stayed with Apollo 11 when the two guys went down to the moon. But here he's Capcom, and he is issuing an instruction called Apollo 8, you will go for TLI, translunar injection. That's the rocket burn that got men, for the first time ever, out of Earth orbit and directed towards the moon. So that, I think it's right up there with one small step in history, because that was the instruction for men to leave Earth for the first time. So we'll see that here.
Fido, flight.
Go, Flight.
Are you happy with the maneuver?
Yes, Flight, we're getting just what we wanted to see.
All flight controllers, I want go, no-go for a translunar injection burn. Retro?
Go, Flight.
Control?
Go.
Guidance?
We're go.
Inco?
Go, Flight.
Ecom?
We're Go, Flight.
GNC?
Go, Flight.
FAO?
We're Go, Flight.
Network?
Network, go.
Surgeon?
Go, Flight.
Capcom, we are go for translunar injection.
Apollo 8 Houston, you are go for TLI. You are go for the moon.
Roger, Houston. Apollo 8 is go.
So there you go, that's how it all works, and that's Apollo 8 on its way. Apollo 8 was the second manned Apollo. Apollo 7 was actually the first, but that only went to low Earth orbit. And the first manned flight on the Saturn V, and the first manned use of Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center, which is the one that Elon Musk still uses for his launches now. First humans to journey to the moon, first pictures of the Earth from deep space taken by astronauts, we'll see some of that later. And a new world speed record for people of 24,200 miles per hour, that's just under 39,000 kilometers per hour. And first live TV pictures of the lunar surface, so pretty good, pretty good. Successfully tested the Saturn V rocket, first, second and third stages, and the SPS rocket and the command and service module, all successfully tested by Apollo 8. But they didn't test the lunar module because they didn't have one. They didn't do any docking and navigation because they didn't have a lunar module. They didn't get out, so they didn't test backpacks or anything like that. And it was only 6 days long, not the full 10 days of a full moon mission, so there was a bit more testing to be done. So, 2 more missions before they went to the moon, and the first of which was Apollo 9. Now, I always thought Apollo 9 was a bit of a waste of a Saturn V because it launched a fully moon-capable rocket into low Earth orbit only. It did stay there 10 days, and they carried out a barrage of tests of docking and undocking the command module and the lunar module. Had the crew of Jim McDivitt on his second and last space flight, Dave Scott, second space flight, he went to the moon later, and Rusty Schweickart, who only did that one mission, Apollo 9. But, so you can see various things here. They took the lunar module, they got the lunar module out. I'll show you a bit how that works later. They docked, undocked. They actually got 100 miles between the two craft, which actually was a very risky thing to do, because you have to remember that the lunar module itself had absolutely no capability of Earth re-entry. It would simply burn up completely. So if that got into trouble and they couldn't get back to get the astronauts into the command module, they'd have been in very big trouble there, but it all worked perfectly. They obviously learned a few things along the way, and that prepared them for Apollo 10. And Apollo 10 was the full dress rehearsal for the moon landing. 18th of May, launch, came back 26th of May. The crew was Tom Stafford on his third space flight, John Young, third space flight, and Gene Cernan on his second. And actually John Young and Gene Cernan would actually go to the moon, both as commanders of their respective missions, Apollo 16 and 17, later on in the program. It was all going very well, and then they nearly lost the entire mission. And probably the best person to explain that here is Gene Cernan. He explains what went wrong.
When we made 2 passes over the lunar surface on Apollo 10 with the lunar module, separated from our command module several, I don't know, tens or hundreds of miles away, on the second pass, we then simulated what would have to be done on the surface, where you separate the 2 stages, fire the ascent engine, and we're on our way to a rendezvous. And we did that with the abort guidance system, rather than the primary guidance system, just to check out everything. We also checked out the landing radar on that mission and found out that it had been programmed improperly, and had that happened on Apollo 11, they would not have landed. So we found out some interesting things on Apollo 10.
The landing rehearsal was nearly complete. All that remained was to separate from the descent stage of the LEM and fly back to the command module. Stafford began resetting the controls, unaware that Cernan had done exactly the same thing.
And I had all the switches set, and Tom instinctively, as we will do, will reach over there and change the position of the guidance switch, because he knew it had to be changed to AGS. Well, I had already changed it to AGS. And so when it fired, it was on a primary guidance system, and the primary guidance system didn't know where to tell it go. So we did separate and spun out of control. I remember seeing a lunar horizon go by in different directions about 8 times in some 15 seconds. Tom took it back from the computer, got it under control. We gave it back to the abort guidance system. We got the burn on time when we rendezvoused, and everything turned out all right.
It was later determined that the lander had come within 2 seconds of crashing into the lunar surface before Stafford and Cernan regained control. Despite the few unnerving seconds, Apollo 10 had cleared a pathway almost down to the lunar surface. Snoopy's mission was over. The next LEM to fly was reserved for Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. It would be called the Eagle.
Okay, so Apollo 11, yeah. So here's the crew of Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong, commander on his second and last space flight. Michael Collins, he'd been the Capcom. We saw him earlier being the Capcom on Apollo 8, but he was the command module pilot. He's the one who doesn't go to the moon. He stays up there, also on his second and last space flight. And Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot. Now, all of these guys, they didn't do any further space flights after Apollo 11. And I suppose when you've been to the moon and walked on it, I suppose, you know, what else is there to do? You could hang around and maybe do it again later, but maybe they didn't want to. So launched 16th of July 1969, 13:32 Universal Time from Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center, and the landing in the North Pacific Ocean 8 days later on the 24th of July in the afternoon. And the achievement, of course, was that Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon, and followed 19 minutes later by Buzz Aldrin. One thing I probably didn't mention is that with Apollos 9 and 10 they had to have separate names for the command module and lunar module, because calling them Apollos 9 and 10 wouldn't work, because at one point they had 2 spacecraft. The command module of Apollo 11 was Columbia. The lunar module, probably more famously, was Eagle. But they brought in a third variable, that when it was actually on the moon, the lunar module was called Tranquility Base, because it was mankind's first base on the moon for that length of time. And there's the mission patch of an Eagle landing on the moon there. So there, liftoff, 16th of July 1969. 2 hours 33 minutes into the mission, that translunar injection burn we saw for Apollo 8 there, that's the one that takes them out of Earth orbit and sets them on the way to the moon. And 75 hours 50 minutes into it, so what's that? That's 3 days and a bit later. Lunar orbit insertion burn, and that puts them into a very sort of elliptical orbit of 61 by 169 nautical miles. And then they 5 hours later they do another rocket burn to put that into a more circular orbit, going around the moon every 2 hours at that stage. So after they've set off on the way to the moon, they turn around and go and fish out the lunar module from the back part of the spacecraft and dock it onto the front of the command module, the capsule there. So then, a bit later on, 100 hours and 40 minutes into the mission, they undock that lunar module with the astronauts Armstrong and Aldrin on board. And then they fire for a short while the descent engine there, just for 29 seconds, and that separates the two craft, so they're not actually orbiting the moon together. One has got distance from the other. And then, just under an hour after that, they fire that descent engine and slow down and drop onto the moon's surface. And that there is no air on the moon, there are no wings don't work, whatever. It is purely that engine firing that keeps them above the ground. And so they fire that engine for about 12 minutes or so until they actually touch down. Now this was all quite hairy in the case of Apollo 11, because they actually had gone on a little bit from where they really wanted to be in terms of the landing site, and Neil Armstrong had to take the controls and land manually in a place that he thought was suitable. They had intended then to have some sleep on the moon, but actually they said, well, you know, we're here now, let's get out and do it. But the best bit of this, I'm going to play you a tape from a few years ago, is actually being talked down through the descent. And there is no better person to do that than Neil Armstrong.
This slide shows the trajectory to the surface. The actual powered descent of the lunar module to the surface took 12 minutes and 32 seconds. And this is just the final 3 minutes, the part that's really interesting as you get close to the surface of the moon. Now, in the left screen, you will see the original 1969 movie film that we took from the window of the lunar module Eagle. And on the right side, you will see what the crew saw looking out the window in front of them. Now, there is a shaded area there that shows you the exact duplicate of the area that's on the left, so you can compare the craters and see if they are duplicate of each other. The one on the left took place 42 years ago. This pictures on the right took place in the last 2 years. Okay, we've been descending. I should tell you, you'll hear the crewman talking. They're my co-pilot giving altitude and descent rates, and you'll hear people in the background talking from mission control on Earth. We've been descending about 2,000 meters a minute. We're now down to about below 1,000 meters in altitude. My computer tells me that it's taking us to a landing just on the right side of that big crater up in the left-hand corner. The slopes are steep and the rocks look very large, the size of automobiles. Certainly not a place that I want to land. So I took over manually from the computer, the autopilot, and flew it like a helicopter on out to the west to try to find a smoother, more level landing spot. The computer is complaining now and then. You'll hear caution alarms, 1202s and 1201s, which is telling us the computer is a little bit concerned about its operation, but everything looks good, and the people in mission control tell us we can continue. Okay, we're about 100 meters above the soil, looking down at this 30-meter crater, about 8 meters deep. Looks like a real geological treasure. I want to go back there and look at that if I ever get the chance while I'm on foot. We're looking for a smooth spot beyond that crater. I see a smooth spot right up near the top of the screen. It looks like that's a good place to be, and I'm running low on fuel. I have less than 2 minutes of fuel. Getting down below about 70 meters now. 50 meters, still looking good. In the left side, you will see in the old movie that the rocket engine is starting to kick up some dust off the surface.
Lights on. 6. Down 2.5.
Get a 30-second fuel warning. Need to get it down on the ground here pretty soon before we run out. Okay.
43 down 2.5.
The picture on the left is more accurate, but there's more dust. There you see the shadow of my landing leg coming on the surface on the blowing dust. We're very close to the surface right now.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility base here.
So there you go. That's Neil Armstrong describing his own descent, and even on the original footage, he sounds fantastically calm for someone who's realised that his computer has got it wrong, and he's got to take over and land it manually. And then he gets down to, oh, I've only got 30 seconds fuel left, I suppose I better get down now. And he actually landed with about 15 seconds of fuel left there, after which the spacecraft would have crashed. So that's it. They landed on the moon, 20th of July, that's to say today, 52 years ago, 1969, at 2017. The first step actually was tomorrow in Universal time, but actually American time it was still today, late in the evening. I was actually woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts by my father, who wanted me to see this. Fortunately, they did a total of 2 hours and 31 minutes. That's all. They went all the way to the moon and then did that. Just a little local note here that Neil Armstrong includes amongst his ancestors cattle rustlers from County Fermanagh. So there you go. There's an Irish thing to everything. They went out and they released the equipment, got the television camera out. 109 hours 24 into the mission. He stepped out to the moon. Got one rock sample. First of all, that's what he did, just in case they had to leave. And actually, that's the first thing that they did when they landed, was prepared to leave. Just in case they had to for any reason. Buzz Aldrin stepped out 19 minutes later. And here's that one small step.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the LEM now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
So that's the thing about 1969 technology, that spacecraft were absolutely fantastic, but television cameras were dreadful. Those, unfortunately, were the best pictures they could get with the equipment they had at the time. But the fact, I suppose, of getting pictures from that far at all is quite amazing. So they did some experiments. They did some science while they were there. They deployed some experiments on the moon. First one, solar wind composition. The moon, having no atmosphere, is directly exposed to the solar wind, which contains a large amount of helium-3, actually, which may come in useful one day if we ever perfect fusion power. They could analyse that there. They also got a larger sample of lunar material, that's rocks, to bring back for analysis. They left a laser-ranging retroreflector. This was basically a mirror of sorts, and what that does is you fire a laser from Earth and get the reflection off those mirrors, and all of the Apollos left one, so there's 6 there. And what it's showing us now is that since 1969 we're over 1 meter further away from the moon, or the moon is further away from us, because and that is due to the actions of the tide on the Earth, as the moon's gravity moves water up and down on the Earth. It slows down the Earth's rotation and makes the moon's rotation around the Earth go into a higher orbit. So there we are. That's an interesting one. Then they got a 2-core tube sample of the soil as well. Let's say they dug down a bit, and after those experiments, 2 hours and 15 minutes later, they went back to the lunar module. They slept, and then after 21 hours 36 minutes, they lifted off from the moon, returned to dock with the command service module. They docked back up with the service module and came back to Earth and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on the 24th of July 1969. That's what's that? That's about 52 years ago on Friday, isn't it? So there you go. That was the mission statement. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. And on the 24th of July 1969, that goal was achieved when they safely returned to the Earth. So that's that. There's a whole different aspect to the Apollo story, because it carried on considerably after that. And I do have a part 2, which I will share with you on another occasion, we think, because it might go on too long tonight. But I'm a big fan of a TV show that came on in 1968 first, and I still watch it now and then, only now and then these days, because I've seen pretty much all 69 episodes. But that TV show was called Columbo, and there he is, and that's his catchphrase. And I have got just one thing for you, one more thing. Let's go back to Apollo 8, the Apollo 8 mission, where they went to the moon and they went around the moon 10 times, and then they came back to Earth. And something happened on orbit 4. So let's reconstruct orbit 4 around the moon of Apollo 8.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, is that pretty. Hey, don't take that, it's not scheduled. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color, quick.
Oh man, that's great. Where is it?
Quick.
Down here?
Just grab me a color. A color exterior.
There.
Yep.
That one? Yeah, I'm looking for one. C368.
Anything, quick.
Here.
Okay. We missed it.
Hey, I got it right here.
Let me get out this thing. A lot clearer.
Bill, I got it framed. It's very clear right here. Got it?
Yep. Take several of them.
Take several of them. Here, give it to me.
Wait a minute, let me just get the right setting here. Now, just calm down, Lobo.
Well, I got it right. Oh, that's a beautiful shot. 250 at F11. Now there's exposure.
I did. I took 2 up there.
You sure you got it now?
Yeah, it'll come up again, I think.
So there you go. See, that's and what Bill Anders, the lunar module pilot, who had no lunar module to pilot, so he took pictures out the window. What he had to say about his own photograph, that of course became famous and kick-started the green lobby a long time, perhaps before it otherwise would have got going. We came all this way to explore the moon, and the most important thing is that we discovered the Earth. That's what Bill Anders had to say about his own photograph, and that's probably the biggest lasting legacy of Project Apollo that there is that photograph, and the appreciation of what our own home looks like from very far away. So that's all I have to say to you. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed that. And if you have any questions, we can unmute and talk about those.